Welcome back to beyoungministry.blogspot.com, to another blog, to another podcast. We're in Luke chapter 9. We are in Luke chapter 9, verses 12 through 17, which reads, Late in the afternoon, the 12 came to him and said, Send the crowd away, so they can go to the surrounding villages and countryside and find food and lodging, because we are in a remote place here. He replied, You give them something to eat. They answered, We have only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, unless we go and buy food for all this crowd. About 5,000 men were there. But he said to his disciples, Have them sit down in groups of about 50 each. The disciples did so, and everyone sat down. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke them. Then he gave them to the disciples to distribute to the people. They all ate and were satisfied. And the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. That's Luke chapter 9, verses 12 through 17. Today we come to the heart of the feeding of the 5,000. One of 2 miracles recorded in all 4 Gospels. This is one of those passages where the compassion and sympathy of the Lord Jesus is manifest on the biggest possible stage. In fact, this is quantitatively the biggest miracle the Lord Jesus performed. The feeding of the 5,000 marks the high point of his Galilean ministry. This true story happened in April of the year. The Lord Jesus had been ministering in Galilee, now past the halfway point of his 3-year ministry. He is about to leave the area. During all of this time, he preached the gospel and performed miracles. His goal was to tell people of the wonderful good news of the forgiveness of sins and a personal relationship with God. All of Galilee had listened to his messages, but a small portion of Galilee believed. The feeding of the 5,000 was his high point and the beginning of the end of his ministry in Galilee. In Luke 9:12 we read, Late in the afternoon the 12 came to him and said, Send the crowd away so they can go to the surrounding villages and countryside and find food and lodging, because we are in a remote place here. Now this is a miracle about feeding people, and it exhibits again this amazing concern of God for the simple things. Many of these people were locals, and although this isn't a place where they can get food, the disciples reminded the Lord Jesus to get rid of the crowd so that they could go get a bite to eat. Perhaps the disciples were more motivated by their own hunger. They knew they were eating, or they knew they weren't eating until this crowd left. They had no idea the Lord Jesus' biggest miracle was about to take place. In verse 13, the Lord tells them to give them something to eat. They had just come back from their mission of casting out demons, raising the dead, healing the sick, and preaching the gospel. Through that trip, the disciples had access to the power of God to do the miraculous. But as illustrated here, the disciples had a horizontal view of reality. They looked around at the 5,000 men, women, and children, added up to some 15,000. And they looked at the 5 barley loaves loaves and 2 fish, which they had taken from a little boy. According to John 6, Philip checked the money bag, and they only had 200 denarii, 200 days' wages, not enough to feed the crowd. The training of the disciples was continuing, and they didn't realize it. You see, God speaks to us through the most unexpected every day, and we miss it just like these disciples. By the way, it was Andrew, Simon's brother, Simon Peter's brother, who found the little boy with the fish. In John 6, 8 through 9, we read, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said, "There's a lad here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are these among so many people?" These loaves really were biscuits, and the fish were dried fish, with 5 biscuits and some dried fish, pardon me. The Lord Jesus wowed them all. In verse 14, we read, the Lord Jesus said to his disciples, "Have them sit down in groups of about 50 each." Then, in verse 15, we read, the disciples did so, and everyone sat down. They did it, and everybody was ready to eat. And then, verse 16, the miracle happens. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke them. Then he gave them to the disciples to distribute to the people. This is the one by whom all things were made, and without whom nothing was made that was made, making more from little. Nobody questions this, and yet everybody there knew that there's no food except what he's creating. And he's creating it so that it's distributed among the entire crowd. It's little wonder that they say in John chapter 7, this is the Christ. This is the Messiah. According to verse 17, they all ate and were satisfied. There it is again, the theme of John. His fullness, man's emptiness. Except here, everybody is filled or full. The Greek word kortazo is used. It is also used in Revelation 19 and verse 21, which reads, all the birds will be gorged with their flesh. The scavenger birds at Armageddon, the massacre at the end of the age, will gorge themselves on the flesh of the dead who will be slaughtered by the returning Christ. They ate like they had never eaten before. These must have been the best fish and biscuits ever. They ate like they had never eaten before. At the end of verse 17, we read, and the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. Now this miracle was done for the benefit of the 12 disciples. When the disciples collected the leftovers, the broken leftovers, they were exactly 12 baskets full, one for each disciple. The Lord Jesus provided for them, for the 12, what they needed. You will remember in the previous section there was a 12-year-old girl dying, and a woman who had had an issue of blood for 12 years. And here each disciple, all 12 of them, was given a close-up reminder of the miraculous provision of God and how he is the fulfillment of all of our desires. Do you suppose the Lord Jesus was expecting one of the disciples to consider all the possibilities? The disciples thought, we have 5 loaves, 2 fish, and Jesus, standing next to the disciples, was the solution to not just this problem, to all their problems, but they stopped there counting and they resorted to worrying. What about you and me? Are we counting our problems or are we counting on the Lord Jesus? My friends, I trust this podcast and this vlog are helping you in your walk with the Lord. If I can be of further assistance to you, shoot me an email at beyoungministry@gmail.com.